Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck, here with my co-host Marco. How's it going, Marco?
Hey Chuck, I'm good, man. And super excited about today's episode. We're diving into one of the most fascinating and tragic stories in American history, the story of Black Wall Street.
That's right. Black Wall Street was a thriving African-American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known for its prosperity and success during the early 20th century. It had it all: doctors, lawyers, successful businesses, and a sense of pride and community that made it a model of Black achievement.
But then in 1921, it was brutally attacked and destroyed in one of the worst incidents of media-stoked racial violence in U.S. history. Today, we're going to talk about what made Black Wall Street so remarkable, what led to the massacre, and how the legacy of Greenwood lives on.
So buckle up, folks, because this one's equal parts inspiring and devastating. Let's start by setting the scene in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the early 1900s.
First off, let's talk about what Tulsa was like back then. Oklahoma became a state in 1907, and Tulsa quickly grew thanks to the oil boom. But it wasn't just wealthy oil barons who moved there. Many African Americans headed to Oklahoma, looking for opportunities and a chance to escape the racial oppression in the South.
Exactly. One of those people was O.W. Gurley, a Black businessman who's credited with creating Black Wall Street. Gurley purchased land specifically for Black ownership and business development. He encouraged other African Americans to come settle in what became the Greenwood district of Tulsa.
Gurley was forward-thinking. He believed that African Americans could thrive if they were able to invest in their own businesses and community. Greenwood quickly became a hub for Black entrepreneurs, filled with hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, clothing shops, barber shops, and even a movie theater. It wasn't just surviving, it was thriving.
And they weren't small-time businesses either. By 1921, Greenwood had a total of around 191 Black-owned businesses. This included some impressive establishments, like the Stratford Hotel, one of the finest hotels owned by African Americans in the country at that time.
And not just businesses, Greenwood had Black doctors, lawyers, and teachers. There was even a Black-owned bank. Dr. A.C. Jackson, for example, was a prominent Black surgeon in the area, considered one of the best in the nation.
It's hard to imagine just how groundbreaking all this was. Greenwood wasn't just a wealthy community, it was a symbol of Black success, independence, and resilience in a time when Jim Crow laws were enforcing segregation across the United States.
Right, and because of this success, Greenwood became known as Black Wall Street. It was the shining example of what Black communities could achieve.
The success of Black Wall Street did not sit well with everyone, especially with some white residents in Tulsa. Racial tensions were on the rise across the United States after World War I, and Tulsa was no exception.
Yeah, and it wasn't just because Greenwood was a prosperous Black community. It was because that prosperity highlighted the economic disparities of the time. Simply put, Black success challenged the racial status quo.
Exactly, and this led to growing resentment. Many white people were unsettled by the idea that Black citizens could be just as wealthy, if not wealthier than them. The media at the time often portrayed the people of Greenwood in a negative, false light, stoking racial animosity.
Tensions hit a boiling point in late May 1921. On May 30th, a young Black man named Dick Rowland, a shoe shiner in Greenwood, was accused of assaulting a white woman named Sarah Page in an elevator. Although the details were murky and the evidence was minimal, it was enough to spark a mob.
Absolutely, and this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was no clear evidence of an assault, but the accusation alone was enough to fuel racial hysteria. The local paper, the Tulsa Tribune, even printed an inflammatory article with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator," which stirred anger further.
By May 31st, a white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. Rumors began circulating that the mob intended to lynch him. In response, a group of Black men from Greenwood, many of them World War I veterans, armed themselves and went to the courthouse to protect Rowland.
That's right, Marco. But the situation escalated quickly. The two groups clashed, a shot was fired, and all-out chaos erupted. This was the beginning of the Tulsa Race Massacre.
The events of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which began on the evening of May 31, 1921, were both horrific and unprecedented. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of violence, it was a carefully orchestrated attack by a mob that numbered in the thousands, which was heavily influenced by racial tensions that had been building in Tulsa for years.
That's right, Marco. After the standoff at the courthouse, where both black and white Tulsans had gathered around Dick Rowland's case, tensions erupted. When a shot rang out, reports differ on who fired first. The situation devolved into chaos. The white mob turned its anger toward Greenwood, unleashing a wave of destruction on the black community that was swift, brutal, and horrifyingly thorough.
The scale of the violence was staggering. This wasn't just a crowd venting its anger, it was an organized assault. White residents, armed with weapons from the local armory, descended on Greenwood, shooting indiscriminately and setting fire to homes, businesses, churches, and schools. The mob spared nothing, systematically going from building to building, torching everything in its path.
And the assault was not limited to ground attacks. Astonishingly, private planes, yes, private planes, were used to drop firebombs on Greenwood. This was essentially an aerial assault, with eyewitnesses later recalling how planes flew low over the district, dropping incendiary materials that ignited even more fires. The planes were also used for reconnaissance, helping to coordinate the attacks from the ground.
The level of complicity from local authorities is just chilling. Rather than stepping in to protect Greenwood's residents, Tulsa's police and local law enforcement actually deputized members of the white mob, handing them badges and essentially authorizing them to continue their rampage. Many law enforcement officers were seen actively participating in the violence, rather than attempting to stop it.
And for the residents of Greenwood, it was a fight for survival. Many families hid in basements or fled the city altogether, while others tried to defend their homes with whatever weapons they had. But they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. When morning came on June 1st, much of Greenwood lay in smoldering ruins, and the extent of the massacre was clear.
The aftermath was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that nearly 300 black residents lost their lives in the massacre, though the exact number will never be known, as many bodies were hastily buried in mass graves or even dumped in the Arkansas River. Over 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed, leaving roughly 10,000 people homeless. Greenwood, a once thriving community, was reduced to ashes within hours.
In the hours and days that followed, the survivors were rounded up and held in internment centers. These weren't just temporary shelters, these were detention camps where survivors were kept under armed guard. Many people who had lost their homes and businesses were not even allowed to leave the camps until a white employer or white resident vouched for them.
And, as if the massacre wasn't enough, the survivors were hit again when insurance companies refused to cover the damages. Most policies included clauses that denied coverage in cases of riots, and the destruction of Greenwood was officially classified as a race riot, despite the fact that it was a coordinated assault on black residents. This left families who had lost everything without any financial means to rebuild.
It's hard to overstate how devastating this was. Survivors not only faced the trauma of losing loved ones, homes, and livelihoods, but they were also left destitute. Many were forced to leave Tulsa altogether, while others tried to rebuild despite facing extreme poverty and ongoing racial discrimination.
And though some of Greenwood's residents did manage to rebuild in the years following the massacre, the attack forever altered the district and deeply scarred the community. Many residents, unable to reclaim their former lives or property, were left with only memories of what had once been a prosperous community. It's hard to even imagine the kind of resilience it took for them to start over after losing so much.
The Tulsa Race Massacre was more than just an isolated incident of racial violence, it was a full-scale assault on a thriving black community. The people of Greenwood had built something extraordinary in the face of segregation, economic barriers, and societal prejudice, and in one night, it was all torn away.
As incredible as the story of Greenwood is, it was largely forgotten outside the community for decades. The massacre wasn't taught in schools, and survivors were often too traumatized to share what had happened.
Yeah, this was practically erased from public memory. It wasn't until the 1990s that serious efforts were made to bring the Tulsa Race Massacre into the national conversation. And even then, it was a struggle to get justice for survivors and their descendants.
There have been official investigations, documentaries, books, and even attempts at reparations for the descendants of Greenwood's original residents. Recently, even Hollywood has helped bring attention to the story. The HBO series Watchmen, for instance, opened with a depiction of the massacre, and that was one of the first times many Americans had even heard of it.
And while those depictions have helped bring this story to the forefront, there's still work to be done to truly honor the legacy of Greenwood. There's an active push for memorials to honor the memory of those who lost their lives and the families who lost their livelihoods.
Absolutely. Greenwood and Black Wall Street's legacy reminds us not only of the horrors of racial violence, but also of the strength and resilience of the black community. Their story didn't end in 1921, it's very much a part of today's ongoing conversations about historical acknowledgement.
Before we wrap up, we want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this important journey through history. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star review. It really helps others discover the podcast and allows us to keep bringing these stories to light.
And don't forget, you can connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear your topic suggestions or even your thoughts on this episode. Also, check out our brand new merch, there's a link in the show notes. Wear your history pride.
Thanks for joining us on the History AI podcast. Until next time, I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep history alive. See you next time.
Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.